Good morning and welcome to the latest conversation that matters. In honor of Black History Month, today we are going to be talking with two clergy from the United Church of Christ as we both celebrate our past, our heritage, what has been, if you will, but also use that history to inform our present and future as well. So we have a couple guests with us today, and I will let each of them introduce themselves. And so let's begin today by asking Reverend Dr. James Fouther Jr. to introduce himself and tell you a little bit about his ministry experience.
It is a joy, friends, to join you for this conversation. Thank you, Pastor Craig, for your invitation to this conversation as well. I'm Reverend James Fouther, pastor of the United Church of Montbello in Denver, Colorado, currently. I've been here in my longest ministry in Denver for 19 years as of this year. And the first person I had lunch with when I got to Denver was a curious and interested colleague by the name of Pastor Craig Peterson. He called and I welcomed that call and was glad to have lunch with him and begin getting to know him. And I count him a friend from that time on, as we have done ministry in the United Church of Christ in various times and places, sometimes together, certainly together here in Rocky Mountain Conference, in the Metro Denver Association while he was here. But as much now as always, we all are on the front lines of doing ministry and across these internet airwaves as well. I grew up in Chicago. I grew up in the Chicago Metropolitan Association. I grew up in a church, the Congregational Church of Park Manor, that proudly names itself the Congregational Church of Park Manor because Park Manor Congregational Church, the congregation in that very same building, around 1957, when we had our founding as a congregation, had a Sunday where the congregation that was predominantly white and seeing the neighborhood change around it very radically, and knowing Chicago's neighborhoods, the whole neighborhood was becoming predominantly African-American at the time. And rather than integrating, that congregation decided they would, as a whole congregation, pick up and leave. And when they did, they left a building, they left a possibility for new ministry, and we were rechartered as the Congregational Church of Park Manor in the very same year, Craig, that the United Church of Christ was founded. So we trace our heritage all the way back to the beginning of the founding of our denomination. And that's where I grew up. Wow. I grew up there, was married there, was confirmed there, was baptized there. As a boy at 9 years old, my dad walked out going to his job at Model Cities for the city of Chicago and had a massive heart attack and died at work on the elevator on his way to the office. And I was embraced by the chancel choir, where he was a tenor soloist. And they stood with me as my family on my confirmation day, that whole choir. So, of course, I would come to sing in that choir. And it's from a faith formation standpoint, a place where I felt safe, I felt affirmed, I felt loved by the whole congregation. And I've been back to preach various the 50th anniversary celebration to preach on a Sunday morning for the trustees, and been back for various funerals and so forth as well. So I consider myself connected to my home church. I went from there to Chattanooga, Tennessee to serve a New Church Start for a time. My first daughter was born in Tennessee, and soon after, the pulpit became open at Church of the Open Door Congregational United Church of Christ in Miami. I served there for 6 years. I began my Doctor of Ministry degree and started in the Eden Theological Seminary program for pastors for that degree that was really centered on Florida pastors. And in that vein, there were some scholarship funds that kind of helped, and the church also helped with continuing ed funds for that while I was in that program. And following that, I served a large church. I served in Sarasota, Florida. I served First Congregational United Church of Christ, where my senior pastor during that time was the Reverend Dr. John Seister. There, we were able to go through and complete an O&A process during my time. And I was a person on staff that was charged with helping families make that transition. And we were proud to say in that very large 900 member church that that we only lost one family during the O&A process. Wow. And you know, Sarasota, it turns out, is one of the most conservative pockets in Florida and in the country. So needless to say, once I completed my DMin while I was on staff there, I accepted a call to my current charge, and that's where I met Pastor Craig. That's where I am serving now, and I'm on the other side now of COVID with my same congregation. So I'm glad to join you for the conversation, Craig.
Great, thanks so much. So, James, in the United Church of Christ, we talk a lot about being a denomination of firsts. On our website, we note that Congregationalists were among the very first to take a stand against slavery, which includes when Reverend Samuel Sewall published the first anti-slavery pamphlet in the United States history. A Congregationalist by the name of Phyllis Wheatley then became the first published Black author. And Congregationalist Lamel Hayes was the first Black man ordained by a Protestant denomination. All amazing firsts. We even talk about the role that Congregationalists played in the Amistad case. So I'm wondering today if you would talk with us about what it means to be a part of a denomination and tradition that since its earliest days took such bold stances.
It's a great joy, Craig, to know that we are amongst the many mighty, wonderful firsts that you've named. But I'll name one more, which was very directly a blessing to me, and that is the very first to serve as the president of the Association of Theological Schools and Theological Fund, and then the first president, the first African-American president of Chicago Theological Seminary, a fellow by the name of Reverend Dr. Shelby Rooks. It is because of his commitment to education, because of his great ministry in the United Church of Christ, that for generations since his death and during his life, African Americans pursuing theological education at Chicago Theological Seminary had a fellowship available to them, which was one also available to me. And it helped so that I could go through my MDiv program without the crushing debt that sometimes theological students leave their programs with. I needed to in order to get the fellowship, I needed to maintain an above B average in my studies. I needed also to serve the United Church of Christ, either in the parish or in an approved setting for ministry. Of course, parishes all were at that time, for at least 5 years. And I've done that. So I've fulfilled the criteria that it asked for. I love the story of Reverend Lemuel Haynes, for instance. Folks believe that the American Revolutionary War was a war fought and won by mostly European Americans. That there wasn't the witness of soldiers in that war that were people of color, and he was one. He was one, and the time when pastors also served in armies like that just kind of blows my mind. But then would go on to serve with distinction. I love the Amistad story as well. Debbie Allen, the great actress. I just saw a documentary that she was a part of for National Geographic Channel, that she talked about how surprised she was to learn about Sing Bay Pay and the Amistad captives, and the fact that they won their freedom, and the fact that they were able to enlist a former United States president in John Quincy Adams to fight the case. And the case went to the Supreme Court and won. And here with these captives who couldn't speak English fully, but I think it portended for us a commitment to immigrants and to immigrants' plights that I believe is just a part of who we are, part of the fabric of what we do. When we provide sanctuary for immigrants, we are walking in the very best of the traditions of our Congregationalist heritage that we trace back to New England and continue to work in and work through and work with, Craig. So thank you. I'm glad to know that your congregation is celebrating all these historic figures, including Sister Wheatley, that we've got to keep these stories alive, man. We've got to. And Charles Shelby Rooks, by the way, wrote a book, and I pulled it off my shelf. It's called Revolution in Zion, and it's called Reshaping African American Ministry 1960 to 1974. And so it's something of a memoir of his, going back over some of the contributions he made and others made, so that my good colleague, the Reverend Janice Steele, and me would be a part of this wonderful cadre in our generations of ministers who have an ordained status in the United Church of Christ.
Great, thank you for that. James, I just asked about some of the historical achievements at the national level of our denomination, but as pastors, we all know that some of the people who most changed things, where it happened at the deepest level, didn't always get national attention. They were sisters and brothers of the faith that worked hard in local churches and communities to truly bring about the reign of God. So I'm wondering this morning if you would take a moment and share with us some of those saints in our tradition who helped move things forward in the Black community, in your life in particular.
Thanks, Craig. So as I think about the saints who have moved in my life, I begin with the Reverend Dr. Reuben Alphonse Shears II. He served as the executive director of the Office for Church Life and Leadership, but in his role as my pastor at the Congregational Church of Park Manor, where he unfortunately for the church died in office, he brought me as a mentee into my walk at Chicago Theological Seminary. And it was there at Chicago Theological Seminary that my answer to the call of ministry meant that there were two others in the congregation who also answered their call. I don't think any of us would have done that without the sure mentorship of Reverend Dr. Reuben A. Shears. He came to us from the AME Church, and in our conversations about his life in the AME Church, he said, "Doc, I just can't serve with bishops anymore. That bishop structure is something I just can't serve with anymore." I once asked him, the native of Charleston, South Carolina, whether or not he'd visit his home again or wanted to before his death. And he was one who said very frankly to me, he never had a desire to go back to his home of Charleston, South Carolina, because of the racism that he experienced. He saw our congregation flourish in changing times under his leadership, in times when there was great need for us to shore up our youth department and to do various things with our elders in the congregation, as we were an aging congregation, and it remains so even today. But I count his ministry as a strong one. When I was writing my dissertation for Eaton Theological Seminary, I was studying the mentoring practices of African Americans in the United Church of Christ. And one of the great pastors that I studied is actually serving with you in California, and that's Reverend Dr. Yvette Flunder. And I count her as a living wonder in the United Church of Christ. I hope she gets her just due. She came to us from the Pentecostal tradition. She's a singer of some great renown. But as far as mentoring practices, she was one who had pioneered what it means to have ordained ministers on her staff and licensed or what we're calling lay ministers in the new manual on ministry on her staff. She had a variety of folks serving, making sure that her leadership was always bolstered by those who could raise her arms up, as the scriptures tell us, Craig, and keep her going and keep the church prospering in these difficult times. It was during the writing of that same dissertation that I also was able to get to People's Church in Washington, D.C., People's Congregational United Church of Christ, to study a good friend and one who has gone home to glory, the Reverend A. Knighton Stanley. And before his retirement, I was able to get to New York City, to St. Albans Congregational Church, and study the mentoring practices of the Reverend Henry Simmons, Reverend Dr. Henry Simmons as well. For each one of them, local church ministry is a place where they have made great strides to make sure the reign of justice, and in many cases have suffered for it. The reign of justice in San Francisco continues because of Reverend Dr. Yvette Flunder and the kinds of things her congregation does and is doing in Washington, D.C., with Reverend Stanley in New York, in all of these places where we consider liberal thought and progressive actions as part of the fabric of things. These actions don't happen all by themselves, Craig, as you well know. We got to work for them. And those are 3 pastors, 4, including my mentor, Reverend Dr. Shears, that I consider just giants, at least to me, in my ministry. And I am grateful for their answer of yes to the call of ministry and for our paths crossing in my life. And I'll always tell their stories. Thanks.
Thank you for that blessing of remembrance. James, while at the national level, we can talk about all of the firsts that were achieved 100 years ago or more, and yet there's a reality that at the local expressions of the churches, which would be a local church or associations and conferences, we are still to this day experiencing many firsts for Black clergy and lay leaders. And many of my friends have been the first to serve in their particular ministry setting. With that in mind, I'm wondering today if you could talk with us a little bit about the challenges that are still out there today, some of the obstacles and barriers and manifestations of racism, and what we in the church can do to better support these pioneers in the Black community that are doing amazing and wonderful ministry.
Sure, thanks, Craig. So the things that we can do to affirm the African Americans in the United Church of Christ that are still achieving firsts is to welcome more readily into our ministry settings African Americans that we will be patient with, that we will love into their next strides forward, that we will grant a bit of compassionate, loving, chiding, if chiding is necessary to actually help and to actually move those ministers into the place where they are able to do their best work. I have too many colleagues for whom the weight of being a first has meant that they got the hardest treatment, that they didn't get the chance to get to year 5 of their ministry, not due to anything of their own fault, but even in my ministry in Miami, we had a long service minister whose whole world was our church. At the time, I thought, Craig, that that was a beautiful thing. But at the time that I came on board to pastor the Church of the Open Door, Congregational United Church of Christ, he was one that wanted to remain a part of the congregation, and he did so. His membership exceeded the time of my ministry there. I was there about 6 years, and as decisions had to be made and as things happened, there was still that whole sense of allegiance and affirmation that certain members and certain groups within the congregation just afforded him, because he just could not move out or away. I think it's not the kind of thing we encourage from our committees on ministry, and yet it was a very real part of my ministry setting for that time. And other mentors around the United Church of Christ bemoaned it. They talked about it with me and would hug me at general synods and so forth to help me during that time. But I really want to encourage ministry settings to recognize that our best work as ministers, and not just as African-American ministers, our best work. What if our best work as ministers, Craig, happened between year 7 and year 15? If we don't get to year 7, how will you ever know? How will you ever experience that? How will the congregation flourish any other way if we don't have that chance? I think you can take that up a notch, and really, when you apply that to our colleagues of color who are whose gender doesn't match with the predominant number of folk in the congregation, and even I sadly say that women's ministry in the United Church of Christ has not been affirmed the way it needs to be affirmed amongst African Americans, or just generally the number of senior ministers who have been women is a sad number. We have more qualified women ministers that can serve as senior ministers. We just all need to do better in this vein. We all need to recognize that that there's greater work for us to achieve together. And what if that work happens in year 10 instead of year 1? We just can't unload all our expectations as soon as the pastor is hired, as soon as the pastor is brought there. We can't just, there would be an argument that what we're navigating is the whole realm of culture, and that learning even the culture of being in a new place at a new time as a new person, even just that takes something like 3 years. So we just need to, we need to be more patient, more loving, and hold our progressive values as that which can strengthen us rather than that which might divide us.
I'm so glad you made that tie between race and culture, because sometimes when we say we don't see color as a well-intended effort to build bridges, what we're saying by extension is that we don't see culture either. And I was reminded of a story as you were speaking of a clergy colleague of mine, a Black woman who was in a committee meeting at a conference level and had asked folks to refer to her, including her title Reverend, as Reverend, and then her first name. And she was berated by a white colleague saying, you know, in the United Church of Christ, we don't believe in hierarchy. We just want to use first names. And he was using his cultural location and extending that to her. And so she was put in that difficult position of having to kind of explain the cultural context for that. And I thought it's one of those many examples where we don't even realize the obstacles, attitudinal and otherwise, that we're throwing up for our clergy of color. So
No
thank you
doubt.
for raising that. As a denomination that stands upon two theological legs, that is the leg of autonomy, where every local expression of church and individual has the ability to do what they want, and the leg of covenant, where we are bound together by sacred promises. We in the United Church of Christ have a unique challenge in trying to achieve progress. For unlike some traditions who can pass rules that force every local church to make needed change, we don't have that ability. We can pass a resolution at General Synod that puts forward a vision, but still every local church, every association, and every conference can decide whether or not they want to follow that rule. So my question, James, is what can we do in the United Church of Christ to get more and more of our local churches on board and to make those needed changes so we can more effectively address the lingering issues of racism, both in our society, and let's be honest, in our local churches as well?
So, Craig, this is a hard, maybe the hardest question that we've tackled together during our conversation. What if the third leg, besides the first two legs of autonomy and covenant, what if the third leg of our stool has to do with community? And that community is built not just in the national setting of their planning of a wonderful family reunion that we know as General Synod. What if there's a bit of General Synod feeling and spirit in each of the webinars that we're all able to have access to on Thursdays or on Tuesdays online? What if we're able to engender a feeling of recognizing that within community, we are persons that bear a responsibility to one another. And in bearing a responsibility well, we don't feel that the pressure is crushing us. If we bear it well, we feel that responsibility is helping us to achieve the greatest heights we can and making some measure of progress towards a given goal or towards the next step or next stage that we need to get to together? What if in community we are able to look at some of the things that are being pioneered and done in our ecumenical family? I serve an ecumenical church and I'm intensely interested in the United Methodists. I believe that's the denomination of your heritage, Craig, and the Presbyterian Church USA, both of whom say they're connectional denominations. Now, in their basic identity, they know themselves to be something other than our two-legged stool, as you know, as you've noted. And there are times when I see in both of those denominations that folk are able to come together and make progress without edict, without a law, without another line being written in their book of order or their book of discipline or whatever have you, but because their sense of things is that they're connected. Man, I'm connected to you. You're part of my community. You call, you ask if we can do a conversation like this. I'm compelled to say yes. We need to continue compelling one another in the best of what community can be, and recognize that our pitfalls are killing us, man. One of the things I've noticed about this Zoom era of meetings is that we don't have the time in the halls that we used to with meetings. We don't have the time in the parking lots or the time before the meetings sometimes where folk will gather and just continue building community, getting to know one another's reference groups and getting to know one another's loves and strengths and weaknesses. And there's so much more room for us to build community, Craig. And until we're building community in a way where we're all compelled to live out our progressive values, I don't know that we're going to get to where we need to get to in the eyes of a loving God, in the eyes of a God of justice who wants for us to see some progress in all these matters. But we got to keep trying. We're not there yet. We've got to keep trying. I can't pull the covers over my head because I have autonomy and say, I don't care about the other settings of the church. I care about every setting of the church. I care about all of us making progress. So I know you do too. And it's a vexing question, man. It's not one. I think if we had the answer to that, man, we'd be on time for the whole people of God, known as the United Church of Christ.
Well, I was so excited to see one of the offerings, I think later this week, is at the National Expression of Church, is a presentation on bias in search and call. It's a great way for the highest level of church to be in relationship with our local churches, saying we need to be aware of the barriers that we're erecting that are keeping qualified women and people of color and all sorts of social locations out of our local churches. So I gave thanks for those signs of community and progress. And I also really want to emphasize, you and I were talking earlier about one of the greatest gifts our communities of color can give us is they have a much better developed sense of community and commitment to one another than sometimes those white folks of European descent like myself, who tend to be more competitive. And so that's one thing, both from Kwanzaa through Black History Month, that we can really lift up and learn from in universal ways.
Indeed. So,
Reverend James, we're so thrilled to have had this journey with you today. And this takes us to our last question. You have served for a while in our beloved denomination in a variety of places, and you've seen many changes. And what I'm most curious about in closing is, what have you seen in terms of progress that gives you hope for the future? And as I use that word hope, I'm reminded that I was remiss at the beginning of today by leaving out an important first, which is the United Church of Christ helped raise up the first Black president of the United States, President Barack Obama, who attended Trinity for many of his formative adult years. And boy, if there's ever an emblem and a manifestation of hope, it is that a former United Church of Christ member of ours. So James, what gives you hope for the future?
The Rocky Mountain Conference of the United Church of Christ and the Metropolitan Denver Association, the associations around our conference, Craig, have engaged a 2-year period where what's emerged is a committee on ministry for the whole conference. And that committee on ministry for the whole conference now will have a relationship with the Ministerial Excellence Standards and Authorization Team, the MESA team at the national setting, that I believe will help us bridge some gaps between the metro areas and the rural areas that are present in our Colorado setting for ministry, places where all of us are struggling to make sure that these committees have people on them. And the first challenge that came from Mesa was one that said, we need you as you're developing your committee to be younger and to be more diverse. And my goodness, man, might we have said that in our own setting all by ourselves? I had hope that it was Mesa that said to us, consider that for your formation of this conference-wide committee. And it's given me hope. Obama's his whole service to the country as president was something that gave me hope the whole time he was in, even to the point, Craig, where as he faced troubles in his administration and he faced the need to get face forward and feet forward on LGBTQI issues, he needed a spiritual base that I believe, because he had to sever his ties with Trinity, he did not have at that point. But lovingly, I think that there were some things that happened within his in his heart and in his administration that helped things go forward some, even though there's so much more work to do. His whole administration service gave me a great deal of hope. Within the denomination, I love the fact, Craig, that we're getting younger in terms of the number of young ministers that are serving congregations and out there getting ordained and coming in for ordination in far more settings than just parish churches. It makes my heart yearn that these young ministers are not finding parish ministry necessarily as the best place to serve and use all their gifts. They're recognizing that perhaps being a community minister or being a minister in a given setting is something that will use their gifts better, and they don't want to fight the generational wars and the wars of that come with their millennial sort of instincts or Gen X instincts bumping up against baby boomer instincts and so forth. So it gives me hope. At least they're coming to serve. I'd love to see more serving in our local church parishes. Gives me hope, Craig. I've seen sea changes in opportunities for women in the denomination because of folk like Linda Jaramillo in our denomination and her service, folk like Karen Georgia Thompson and her service in the denomination. I have seen in my lifetime women and clergy of color and folks of that I share some manner of heritage with, doing all kinds of things that I never would have dreamed as a boy in this denomination they'd be doing. So it gives me hope to see some progress. I just want to see some more. I think we all do. But
amen, brother. Yeah. Well, and thank you. As we close today, I would say, in addition to someone like President Obama, who gives so many of us hope, it's individuals like Reverend Janice and Reverend you, James, who are living the commitments and the values and paving the way for the hope that will be born for tomorrow. And as we leave the month of February, it's so important that we realize that history is not relegated to the past, that we learn from it and we make today and tomorrow better. And certainly Black history is not something that's boxed into the month of February. It's something that ought to be integrated and celebrated 365 days a year.
Amen. Amen.
So thank you so much. And we look forward to the next conversation that matters in 2 weeks as we begin the celebration of Women's History Month. Blessings on you all.
Thank you, Pastor Craig. Thank you.